Oakley dokley. Let's do this. This is your second last Friday morning webinar.
Woohoo!
Woo! You are almost there. How exciting. So a couple of people still did role plays this week, but not really, because my Tuesday group sort of didn't turn up. Aside from Jade, she gets a prize. So if you're still in a box of humans that haven't been able to do your role plays, I've set one further session that I will run for next week, which from memory, I'm just checking my calendar, is at 4 o'clock on Wednesday. And if you can't make that work, then I'm going to circulate the names and emails of the humans that are left. And you all need to come up with a time that works for you. And you need to tell us what it is. And between the four of us, we'll find one of us that can help you. Because I can't coordinate any more humans. It's going to send me crazy.
Can I just ask, there's the one week when we had role plays. There's not 2 weeks, is there?
No, but some of them, Michael, weren't able to be held in that 1 week. And so there was meant to be some more this week. And then that hasn't really played out. And so now there's one next week. If you want to have another go, you're very welcome to come again. But I'm particularly concerned about the people that haven't done it. Because ultimately we have to sign off to the higher powers to say that you've done certain things as a part of this training. And that's one of those things. So I really do need you to participate in a role play of that first meeting. So please come on Wednesday if you haven't already done one. And as I said, if for whatever reason you can't make that time work, can you please email Emma and I, and we will find a time for it to work. Or you will find a time for it to work and tell me what it is. The first meeting is what you were doing last week. And then this week in your workbook, you were doing some reflections on what would happen between the first meeting and the second meeting. And I've got a lot of those workbooks back in, and it's been actually really interesting to read, I guess, what you would do, what you perceive would be the next steps for our magical friends, John and Judy. So are there any questions off the work from this week particularly that you would like to throw out that anyone wants to troubleshoot at the moment? No? All right. So I'm going to get stuck into this today because John and Linda are going to present for us for most of today. And this is actually one of my favorite parts of this training. I think it's the moment where I always see everyone's eyes just go, oh, right. I can see where this is going now. So just in terms of where we're at, you've had your first meeting. You're now, trying to move the process along. And how many meetings generally do we sort of expect for a standard, in inverted commas, standard type matter?
3 to 5.
3 to 5. Thank you very much, star student Michael. So if we think of John and Judy, I think John and Judy for me, maybe save for the affair that Jacinta added. I didn't have that in my world, so take that out of the conversation. Probably would be a pretty standard 3 meeting matter. First meeting that we did in our role play and we spoke about last week, gathering the data. Second meeting to look at that data and start to think about some options for settlement. And then a third meeting that's likely to be that settlement meeting where it's, okay, I would like this component of that and I would like this component of that, and how do we solve that problem? So that process, just remember with all of your meetings, we come back to this same circle on the slide: prepare, meeting, go and do your homework. And so the meeting that we're going to sort of talk most about today, and this is really for financial settlement matters, property settlement, spousal maintenance, those sorts of things, is the option generation sort of settlement type meeting. So where, say, Linda and or John are heavily involved in helping people to really think about some different scenarios for their settlement. So Linda, do you want to share your screen?
I think John's going to do that actually.
John's going to do it. I've just probably hit a magic button to let you do that. So I'll just try and find that while.
But also I will need to share my screen because I have some very exciting Excel spreadsheets that I'll need to, everyone's just groaning.
Have you allowed us to share yet?
I think so. Can you try for me?
Yep, here we go.
Great.
Just while you're setting that up, we spoke last night on that Facebook Live for those that attended. If anyone wants to come and just sit in a collaborative meeting, either as a note taker or just to observe, I'm really happy for you to reach out. I've got a couple running at the moment. I know the other coaches that are, you know, I work closely with. So if you're interested, a lot of them are running via Zoom at the moment. So got a few hours to spare, jump on.
Can you see the first slide?
Yeah.
Taking up the whole screen?
Yeah.
Awesome. So what Linda and I are going to talk about today is that option generation process. Now that option generation process, we're obviously going to have a financial bent to what we're talking about, but this is it's also part of the whole process. Now we're talking about the option generation process, which is what you've been referred to as the problem solving process. It's all exactly the same stuff. And to prove that, we stole one of Clarissa's slides, which again is what you've been seeing, I think in last week's slides, I think this was, and it's been repeated various times on the way through. When you talked about the problem solving process, we talked about 4 steps. Identify the problem, generate the options, evaluate the options, select your way forward. 6 stages here. Again, we're talking about the same thing, but we're just basically breaking down some of the parts. So stage 1, identify the issue. Stage 2, what information do you need to start doing options to generate, to evaluate options, pathways, and coming up with a solution. Stage 3 is what we talked about before. Stage 2, generate the options. We can't generate the options until we have the information. So that's where stage 2 there comes in. Stage 4, doing the evaluation, but importantly, as part of the evaluation, how do we actually test the pathway that's there? And again, you'll see today we're coming back to, again, part of that testing is coming back to what were the interests and goals of the parties at the outset. And I think that's a really important place to keep bringing it back to, because it helps you define a way forward. Agree a solution, then draft the settlement. Where does it come in? I think we've talked about this before. Again, we're covering a lot of old ground. It comes in everywhere. In the role plays that we did now a couple of weeks ago, depending on which group you're in, the first meeting, someone actually raised, well, how do we actually pay for this? And I said, well, that's one of the agenda items. So let's actually go to that. And we role played this first one. How do we pay the collaborative costs? So just on your chat box, do you want to just throw up, what are some options? Now, Chris, right? Oh, here we go. I don't know if I can see it from here. More chat. I can see it. Yep. Youth joint savings. Pay it from the mortgage. Pay it now. Pay 50. Ask for a freebie.
No go.
That is an option. Shelby, thank you. Sale of the house. Pay at the end. Borrow from parents. And importantly, a combination of all of them. And that's where it's really important in this process. We don't evaluate as we're generating the options. The idea of actually generating options is to actually see what else can we do. It may seem stupid. You may be throwing the option up there thinking that'll never work, and you throw the next one up and that'll never work. We don't evaluate at that point in time. And the reason being is I've had this proven to me time and time again, where the parties throw things up and I'll sit there going, that won't work. I've got my financial head going, that won't work because, that won't work because. I now know to shut up. We put it up on the board. And then when we actually start evaluating, we go back to the interests and then we start looking at what's there. And quite often it's a couple of those silly suggestions that in combination work really well. So it's important to actually get the ideas out there, to get those creative juices working. What can we create as part of this process? I'll just try to, there we go. Now, I think we may have actually talked about previously again, plussing. Plussing is a concept that it's okay to say that won't work, but don't let anyone sit there and at that point. When they're evaluating, knock the idea by all means, but what's something you can throw back on the table? Take it off, but always leave something on there. I don't think that'll work because, but maybe we could try. And remember, and this is not part of plussing, if you actually get a roadblock, that won't work, that won't work, that won't work, what do? Our problem is now not we can't come up with options, or we can't come up with a solution. It is we can't come up with options that are working. So what do? We go back to the interests. And always remember, this is the parties' process. We're not telling the parties the solution. We're helping facilitate them come up with a way forward. And awkward silences work extremely well at this point. So that won't work, that won't work, that won't work. Just sit there. What could work? And let them just stew on it. And it's amazing, someone will break the silence, usually. Is that good? That's our theory section. Now we actually want to go through, we've got 3 examples, 2 we're going to go through in a little bit of detail. Linda's got an example and she'll go first. I've got an example. So we're looking at more a cash flow example and then more a entity type example. So what you'll see here is this is the process that really from the start to the finish, what's the financial doing? So we start with what's the pool? If relevant, we go, what are the expenses? What have we got? We start then with the option generation process. We start developing pathways and we start evaluating. And what we really want to be able to do is to get everything right, get to that evaluation process, because that's where the gold is. And that's where the actual work comes from everyone in the team and the parties. How do we actually make this work, given the interest we have at the start? And I'm also going to throw out there that the standard PowerPoint photos that come up with everything, I got the shits with it this time and I've started going, right, there's got to be some fun photos. So I've thrown some photos in from our last holiday. And most of these have no bearing to what we're talking about at all. So for those who can pick it, the first one, that's Noosa National Park from 2 weekends ago.
Oh, stop it. You'll make all the Melbourne people feel terrible.
This is what outside looks like. I'll
I
cop
was
that
there
later.
the same weekend.
Okay. Linda?
Okay. So I just wanted to talk through an example of a matter that was collaborative, but the interaction of, say, a financial planner wasn't as a neutral option. So it's about thinking about how can what do these people need to come to, what resources can they access to help them to come to a resolution? So in this scenario, we had a high income earner, so Peter, surgeon, earning $1 million a year, his wife, Susan, part-time, earning 70 grand, pretty young in a relative sense, late 30s, 2 young sons. The private school thing, the reason I've kind of gone into that a little bit is that Peter was very, that was his thing. He really wanted them to go to the same school that he had and his father had, that had a very long association. The wife didn't really care. Peter had a significant health issue. Now this is quite integral to the way that the parties were thinking, and you'll see in the interests that they came to how we managed to deal with that. So he was identified with a serious health issue in his early 30s. So he's currently medicated, keeps it under control, but there's no guarantee. So at any point he could be made, basically totally and permanently disabled, premature death. They hadn't gone through any kind of insurance process like most young couples, bulletproof, don't need insurance, hadn't really gone to the trouble of going through that process. So they had no real insurance cover if this issue came up. Susan really kind of kindly, I guess, believed that the health issue had driven his risk-taking behaviours. So he was pretty much having serial affairs with the nurses at work. And in the end, she just called it and just said, no, I'm done. She was more engaged in this process. She was very concerned about his ability, because of the no insurance cover, to actually meet his, to give him some sense of financial security should he not be able to work. So that he didn't want to talk about it. He was just like, nah, yeah, I've got a health issue, but, I'm fine. I don't want to talk about it. He just wanted the whole thing dealt with. He had repartnered. He was really over it. I just want to get this thing sorted at our next meeting. So Susan's lawyer felt that Susan really needed some support to kind of work through what options they'd already generated. So he kind of said, well, this is how I think it should work. She loosely kind of agreed to that, but didn't feel confident about her ability to actually understand what that meant to her in the longer term. Both lawyers actually had experience with us in this type of matter. So his lawyer was also quite comfortable with the concept of her coming off to see us as an offline resource. And she was interested in seeing what our results were and having that brought to the table at the next meeting, because he was just like, I'm not coming again. This is the last meeting. I'm not going to come again. So if we don't come to some kind of agreement, this process is going to fall apart. So there was quite a bit of pressure there on the wife to get herself up to speed. Could you mind just moving that forward, John, to the next slide? So they had worked through their common interests. So I hadn't been part of this process, but they'd worked through that they really wanted their kids to have similar lifestyles at both houses. They really didn't want to have the Disneyland dad and the kids eating baked beans at mum's place. They were wanting genuinely to have a similar lifestyle at both homes. And then the second point there, that financial security and independence for both parties, that's something that we were able to keep coming back to during that, kind of working through the reality testing. So what they loosely agreed to was that they'd like to set aside 1.5 mil each to buy a home, so that we're kind of working through that similar lifestyles at both houses. We had done the work with the wife on her general living expenses, and then we discussed then at that next meeting with the husband, how was he comfortable with those expenses. Now, in that discussion, he was quite belligerent in the meeting. He wasn't terribly happy to be there. And of course, when you look at his earning capacity, it didn't really matter to him. He was just like, well, I don't really care about what it costs me to live because I've got plenty of income. And his lawyer was very helpful in that discussion, in that she said, well, yeah, well, clearly because you have the income. She doesn't have the income. So we do need to really talk about this and be clear on what the expenses are, and kind of agree that, they're fair and reasonable expenses. So we had actually worked with the wife over several meetings, gathering that data with her, going through the bank accounts, agreeing on, what we felt together was reasonable. And so he kind of just said, well, yeah, okay, that's fine. I'm happy to proceed on that basis. the kids are quite young. So at this stage, the children's expenses of 20,000, they both agreed was, quite acceptable. That was, what they expected. And then there was the issue of future school fees. And I'll get to that in a sec. So they agreed that they had basically loosely agreed that they would sell their home. And the reason that was one of the main interests that they were talking, one of the options that they generated was that the wife really didn't want the large house. She just said, look, I just really want something that's easy for me to maintain. They agreed that the boys would be going 50-50 between the houses. She didn't want to be tied down to some big house. So although, there wasn't a huge amount of difference between what they'd decided to spend on their new house to what the current house was worth, they still felt it made sense for them to sell the house. The difference between what they'd agreed, what they were currently at in terms of their proposals and where they're at with their option generation, the difference was really about the cash. So you'll see from the pool, there was quite a bit of cash floating around because they'd agreed to sell the house, and they'd also been saving quite a bit from his income as well over the last few years. So the husband really felt that he needed 400,000 from the sale of the house. The wife should receive most of the proceeds, but he felt he should get another 400,000. The wife kind of thought, well, I don't really see why you really need that given your big income, and I think I should probably get another 400 out of the cash deposits. Now, there was nothing really driving that, so because they hadn't seen what that actually looked like to them. So what is that? What's actually driving that need for the cash? So that's where we came in. The husband also wanted the wife to meet half the cost of the nanny and half of the future private school fees. Now, that was something that we dealt with relatively quickly in that next meeting. So you'll see from the cash flow spreadsheet how we managed to tackle that conversation, and we tackled it up front really early because we needed to work out exactly what the wife's future cash flow needs were. So if John, you could flick to the next slide, please. So again, just that coming back to that settlement, that financial settlement process, considering the cash flow, developing the pathways, determining those pathways, and reality testing them. So really what they'd done is they'd worked through some of those things, and then we were coming in to reality test it. What does this actually look like? Is it going to work? Does it meet your interests? So if John, you could move through. So this was their pool. They also had superannuation, which isn't included in here. They had pretty much agreed to keep their own super, which was relatively equal. So we didn't include it in here. So this is what we were dealing with. So you can see the proceeds of the house there. If this was a Sydney matter, obviously this proceeds of the house could have been much larger. So it might be, 4 mil, 5 mil, 6 mil. But the concepts, I think it's really the concepts that we'd like you to probably take away from today. So what I'd like to do now is move through to the spreadsheet. It's not very pretty, but it's useful. So first of all, I'll just share with you an example of a cash flow analysis that we've done for another client. It's just the cash flow for this particular client probably wasn't ideal. So this cash flow is from a client that is a significant pool. So this pool, again, is, I'll just show you, Can you see that? Is that coming up? Can you guys see a spreadsheet?
Yes.
Yep.
Excellent. So this, I just wanted to walk you through how we go about coming to these numbers, because I often find there's not a lot of science that's going on in the background to developing the cash flow and the part, you know, even in a traditional type of way of resolving matters, the part N. So this matter is reasonably pretty significant. It's about a $140 million pool. And so they've never had to worry about money. They've never had to do any kind of cash flow ever, not for a very long time, you know, their whole married life, really. So in this case, what we did was, and we do this with most people, is grab all the bank accounts, run it through our pivot table, Excel spreadsheet stuff, sit down with our client, walk through the stuff that we can't, so the unallocated stuff that we can't work out. And then we develop like a master kind of Excel spreadsheet thing. And then we sit down with them. So it's usually done in a 2-meeting process, but it can be done relatively quickly. So within a week, generally we can turn this around depending on the client's availability. So in this case, you can see her needs were about 300,000. So I just wanted to show you that first up, so you can see the first step is really identifying the pool, working out what the cash flow needs are of all the parties, and then moving on to then the reality testing of these options. So I'm going to share a different one now. So can you see there, there's a pool with Susan and Peter's situation on it. So
Not yet. I'm still seeing
not
the
yet.
expenses.
You might have to reshare, Linda, to the other spreadsheet.
Okay, so I'll
Come
stop
out of this one and
share.
then share again, yeah.
Reshare.
Yeah.
Different? Okay, so the first scenario that I'll show you is what the husband felt should be happening. So he felt that out of the proceeds of the house, 400 grand should come to him. What does that actually look like? How do we go about doing this? And so what we do is actually, although these spreadsheets aren't pretty, when you see them up on a big screen, we can help the clients work through them. And they don't need to know every single line, but we step them through what the numbers actually mean to them over time. So we do this in the actual meeting so that it's live, so that when we're reality testing, when we're doing an option generation process, then we go, okay, well, let's go away. Let's try and sort out what this looks like. We can come back together and start to reality test each of those options, but do it in a live way so that the clients can see their situation changing over time. So in this case, this is the wife's situation. So you've got here her income, the house purchase, what would be left over after she put another 400,000 across to the husband. You can see there her superannuation. Over on this side, you can see her living expenses, her half of the children's expenses. They had kind of talked about him giving her $10,000 a year in child support, and then the cost of the nanny. So what does that actually look like for her? So you can see there, that's the superannuation and it going up over time. The cash flow, which basically includes her income plus a small amount of investment income, the child support, take out the tax, take out the living, take out the nanny costs, take out the children's costs, and we're left with a cash flow deficit of nearly $60,000 a year. So how does that play out for her when we look at it in a visual sense. So if we have a look at the top graph, just trying to make that, it would be good if I can make that a little bit bigger for you. What that shows is really this 600,000 that she's got left over, kind of which is the combination of her super plus about 400 odd left over from the sale of the house that's invested. So that's all that's her liquidity pot. So she's can't access the super till she's 60. So all she's got to go to meet that extra 60,000 under the current options that they've generated is that 400,000, which you can see quickly just she works through that. So the red bars are her going into the negative, which obviously doesn't happen. It just means that people start to have to adjust their lifestyle. So we went back to what were your original interests and goals? Does this meet them? So one, are we going to have the same lifestyles at both houses? Yeah, we can. But if we do that, she is going to run out of money. And that means that that's not going to give both of them that financial security over time. Does that make sense? Then we looked at, well, what does this actually mean for the husband? So if we have a look at, I'll just go down a little bit. Sorry, let's get rid of that. His position, instead, when we look at, future security, the actual scale on the other side is completely different. So within, 2 years, 3 years, he's pretty much been accumulating assets because he's not spending it. He's hopefully saving it, not spending it on new Maseratis and whatnot. So if he chooses to do that, that's his issue. But he has the capacity to save. And he has the capacity to save to the point that in 3 years' time, he actually has that financial security. So if you recall at the beginning of the conversation, we have a significant health issue that could blow up at any stage. So if he needed to generate $115,000 for himself, if he was ill and he didn't have the insurance, how long would it take him to save to get to that position? So the amount of money that he would need to have if he wanted that money to stay in perpetuity is around that 2 mil mark. So he has his financial security after about 2 to 3 years, whereas she's really in a position that doesn't meet that. So then we kind of said, well, okay, well, what would you like to do? So the options from here could be, well, we could both spend less on a house. That's a valid option. They both kind of discussed that and said, well, look, we don't think that's valid. We're not going to be able to get what we want. They workshopped that. No, that's not going to work. We then talked about the future school fees and talked about the costs of the nanny and discussed that as a team and just said, well, who needs the nanny? And she said, well, I don't actually need the nanny because I work part-time and I'm quite happy to use, the school pickup, the after-school care. And he was like, well, I can't do that because I never know when I'm going to get home. I really need the nanny. And he then just said, well, I guess if I'm the person who needs the nanny, I'll pay. So what we did was then remove that from her side of the cash flow. And that actually did make a bit of a difference. So we talked about that. We then said, okay, well, that's another option. We can see what that looks like. And then he kind of said, well, what if, I don't take quite as much from the sale of the house? What does that look like for her? So what if I took 200 rather than the 400? So we were able to do this in the meeting. We go across to Susan's spreadsheet and we say, okay, you can see already that's making a little bit of a dent in what she actually needs to fund. We took out the nanny costs. So we're going to say she's got no nanny costs. We're going to go over to Peter's and we're going to up his to 30,000. And we're going to see what a difference that makes to her. We're going to have a look at the chart. I'm going to see what a difference that makes straight away. You can see the chart has changed. So in real time, they're able to see what this means to them over not just the next year or the next 2 years. They can see what a difference those adjustments can make over a long period of time. So it means now she's got much more to kind of hold on to, invest, including her superannuation. It's kind of helping her to not eat into her capital as quickly. And she's got definitely a lot more financial security. So she's not, you know, she's able to maintain that. And then let's look at then what that actually means to the husband. So for Peter, how quickly does that impact him? So what it meant was that you can see there's a slight little bit of red there. It meant that even if he just delayed buying a house for maybe, you know, a few months more, he'd be able to save a little bit more cash and be able to buy his house pretty much outright, and really made negligible difference to him being able to, maybe pushed it out 6 months, for him being able to save that $2 million to give him the financial security. Clarissa, can you, in your kind of, I know you kind of had a little bit to do with that matter. You weren't in that meeting, but you kind of heard some of the feedback from it. How do you think seeing that visually impacted the parties?
It was the thing that ultimately settled that case. So the context, Susan was my client. I did participate in the very first collaborative meeting, and Linda wasn't a part of the matter at that point in time. I went into that meeting with an approach with the husband of knowing about his health condition and really trying to be quite empathetic to him around that. And it turns out that was it really didn't work. He sat with his back to the meeting for pretty much the whole meeting. He was one of the rudest people I've ever had to deal with. And the lawyer acting for him wasn't overly helpful in that situation, I thought, as well. At the end of it, I turned to Susan, the client, and I said, I'm so sorry. I've never been involved in anything as difficult as that. And she looked at me and she said, oh, that went much better than I thought it would. I was like, okay. So it was after that first meeting that I reached out to Linda. And part of the challenge was that the husband had a fixed mindset that this was a 50-50 division and there was nothing that was going to change that. So Carly, have I got your attention now? He earns $1 million. My lady earns $70,000. And it's a 50-50 case in his mind. And that position had been reinforced through some legal advice. So it was really hard, because it was really hard for me as a kind, collaborative lawyer going, your legal advice is crazy. And I still had to solve the problem. So that was where we obviously brought Linda in, and it was her ability to move this far away from 50-50 and turn it into, well, what does it actually mean? What does this amount of money actually mean? And you can see how what is a small difference for him made a massive difference for her. And she was very focused on supporting their kids and in part supporting him. She'd lived through him learning about this health condition and observing what that meant. And she was very focused on trying to support him, not create havoc. And so it was really important to her that whatever they did, if he couldn't work in a year's time, that he was going to be okay. So I certainly am of the view that without Linda being involved, this thing wouldn't have settled. I made the decision not to go to the second meeting. I sent one of the other lawyers in my team, because the dynamic between myself, the lawyer on the other side, and the husband was really poor by this stage, that I felt removing myself from it would be a way of hopefully assisting the settlement. And so Linda and the client and I had a very significant preparatory meeting around how she was in essence going to present this information. And the solicitor from my firm, their sole job really was to be a human in the room. And it was like, Linda's here to do this. Can you see the advantage now, Michael, of you being a coach in Queensland and how that could solve my problem from here on end? So, you know, lots of strategy in the background here. But for me, that graph and that visual ability in real time to be able to show, well, what is the impact of her not paying for the nanny? Or what is the impact of $200,000? And literally right then and there be able to see it is the thing that makes the big difference. They didn't settle in that meeting, but they settled not long thereafter through some direct discussions themselves. And Linda, I think from memory, the solution ultimately was that there was no sort of further cash adjustment. That's where they got to between themselves. And it's actually worked out really beautifully for her. She still is in touch with you. She's still in touch with me. She's really content with this settlement. So irony in the whole thing.
So I think part of the issue with sometimes being a neutral in a matter is that you are really unable to continue your relationship with the client. In this case, we knew that, you know, Clarissa knew that she was going to need help post this. The client had said, I'm going to need someone to work with post this. So by being outside of the matter and not having to sign the participation agreement and just really coming to the meeting as a facilitator, but it being really clear who had actually paid my bill, made it easier for her then. He was quite happy for her to continue our relationship, and we now help her manage her money and cash flow and whatever.
Linda, can I just point something in there? When we did our the role of the coach and the role of the financial neutral a couple of weeks ago, that webinar, we talked about the financials role can either be in the process as a neutral or outside the process helping one of the parties. And the really important part we pointed out there is if someone's outside the process, they must be collaboratively trained so they actually work with that actual process. Now, in this case here, Linda worked outside she wasn't the neutral, but because of her role and understanding the process and her relationship with the solicitors, she wasn't neutral. It was all declared she was acting for the wife. However, she was able to come in and actually talk to the husband as well. And the process went well.
Yeah, I think that's an important thing, because we've done this several times before where the husband, when we walk into, when we, are introduced in the room, they're well prepared that this is the scenario. Usually we get a lot of this, like, who are you? You're here for her. And, there's a lot of that. So how we introduce ourselves and talk about why we're involved in collaborative matters in the first place, and that we are here to facilitate decision making, and that we've made some assumptions on your behalf and we apologize if we don't have them right, and all of that kind of stuff. It's all in the way that you communicate can start to lower those barriers down around, you're just here to get the best outcome for her. And they can see, you can't really argue with data. And that's what I think really helps. So I'll stop sharing now.
That pictorial approach, I do find, and you'll see with my spreadsheets that I'm about to show now, I'm in spreadsheet heaven when we go through this next example, because there's just numbers everywhere. And you watch the clients, they're just going, they see all the numbers and they just sit back going, what the hell's going on here? And you can see them shut down. Being able to take it to a graph where they can see a nice pretty picture. And I know I despite I enjoy spreadsheeting, the pictures, I'm very visual in what I do. The graphs are tremendous. Yeah.
And actually a point for Adam, normally when we, Adam would know when financial planners do projections for clients, we normally most of us use the software called Xplan, and we use it's quite clunky because it has a lot of stuff that goes on in the background that's very exact. You know, it works well for compliance reasons, but it's actually really hard to use. It's not very user friendly in these types of meetings. So that's why for every meeting, we pretty much develop a unique kind of set of information that we're very clear it's not exact, that it is very much about just giving them a guide and a pictorial look at how things might look. And there's a whole lot of more exact data that would need to be done if we were producing, you know, personal financial advice.
Can I ask, before Linda and John keep going, I think, into a second example, if there are any questions or comments about that part of Linda's presentation?
Well, it seems that when you look at what John was saying there, when you look at the graphs, it's just become so, well, to me it did, so obvious that that small change could make a big difference to, yeah.
Has anyone had a lot of use of this type of work in their matters?
I had a similar matter, yes, well, not a similar matter, the incomes weren't the same as that. But we sort of broke down what, after they paid all of their expenses, what their cash flow would be moving forward, just to try and illustrate to the husband that he's going to make it up. He wasn't hugely receptive to it though, because obviously he in doing that exercise, I think it's like that big elephant in the room sort of came about. So I wonder, how did the surgeon take that graph, or the lawyer? There in the room?
How we dealt with that is that he then said, well, if she gets to work part-time, I'm going to work part-time.
Yeah.
I'm not going to earn $1 million. So we just went, yeah, cool, that's fine, no worries. What would you like to earn? And he said, oh, well, if I work part-time, I'd probably only earn $600,000. I went, yeah, cool, no worries. Let's put that in the spreadsheet. So we just did it straight up, straight away, just got rid of it and just said, well, this is the graph now.
Oh, it's the same.
Oh, wow, okay, it took you another year. And he, you know, he was like, you know, so you can just I think it's just important to acknowledge that. Just go, yeah, okay, sure, there's risk to your income. There's options for you to not be working the kind of hours that you're working, all of those things. But in the end, it's data.
And did you feel more comfortable doing that because you weren't that neutral? You had actually been engaged by the wife?
No, I've done it before
in the
same context. It's really, it is the elephant in the room, but it's the fact. Like that's what the fact is. And just because someone doesn't like it, because it shows that that's how it actually is, you know, and then you'll have people go, well, that's not my lifestyle. You know, I spend way more than that. You know, I want to go buy a Porsche and I want to have and you go, well, that's cool. That's your wealth management strategy. But you have the capacity to look, it has the capacity to look like this if you choose.
Yeah.
In this instance here, Linda was working for the wife, but was invited into the room to talk in the role as neutral. Although this stuff does happen in the actual joint meetings, it also happens quite often in offline meetings where you're developing the pathway with one of the parties and their solicitor. So in that room, it's all contained in that room. You can be quite hard on the person. And I've had meetings where I'll sit there at the start going, I'm going to be the devil's advocate. You're not going to like me at the end of this meeting. And then with that is my license to be a prick and to actually really push the boundaries on all of those assumptions that are being made. And Linda's talking about, well, let's put in 600,000.
Yeah.
You put in 400,000 or 300,000, it still would have worked because she's earning 70.
Yes.
You know, he does that before his morning coffee on Monday morning.
Just that he doesn't like, you know, just in reality.
Yeah, just because he doesn't like it doesn't mean that, yeah, just because I think Shelby's mentioned it before about it is helpful to have conflict. So it's just as long as it's done in a respectful way. He actually was extremely disrespectful in the meeting. And I think he finished the meeting, his parting kind of words to the entire room were, I can't believe you people make money off the misery of others, and stormed out. So he was not happy. He was really unhappy. So that's.
And you think about that situation, Linda, and you can imagine how unhappy he would be leaving a court process when he doesn't get what he wants anyway. So, you know, he's probably in a lot of personal hurt and grief given his own health and what lies ahead of somebody that no doubt was a very high performer and thought he had life in control. So you could, the writing's on the wall with something like that. It's about, I always say, providing the softest scaffolding to get an appropriate outcome.
Yeah.
And the court process would never have helped her.
No.
She was really alive to that, you know, that was never going to help her.
And how the court process would have dealt with the uncertainty of his health situation, you know, how would that have been dealt with? There was really not a lot of certainty on the actual how the court would have dealt with that. So, you know, although it was hard, it was still probably a good outcome for both of them, I think.
Can I ask a question, Linda? Sure. I might have missed something on the school drop-off, but you were helping her but became a neutral in the room?
No. So it was like I came into the room on the basis that we were sharing the information that we had worked on with her. So it was like sharing the reality testing of the proposals that they'd come up with.
Yeah.
So it was clear, it was very clear that I was not there. I'd been paid by her, so she had paid our bill. But his lawyer, she knew us and we had done matters with her, so she knew our work. So I think there was an element, I think when you think about your team, there's an element of trust in the professionals that you're using that she knew I wasn't going to come in there and handle it poorly, you know, that, you know, I'd probably have the skill set to be able to manage him in the room.
Mm. So you're not subject to the participation agreement.
So I didn't sign the participation agreement.
So what if she'd said to you in that room with Clarissa, well, look, I don't really care long term because, you know, my boyfriend's going to give me, you know, he's loaded and he's going to give me $500,000 a year. Is there an issue with you in terms of divulging that information? Like how does it put you from a really an adversarial, not an adversarial role, but you're engaged by her to do the best for her, throwing you into collaborative law with no participation agreement? Where do you sit?
I think you've just got to be clear about it. Just clear.
I think in that case, Mel, if that had been disclosed to Clarissa,
then
Clarissa as the lawyer who signed the participation agreement would absolutely need to be transparent about that. There's no black and, you know, no grey. That's a fundamental issue.
So Clarissa, you would have to say, well, we have to tell the other side. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and if you don't, we're out.
Yeah, there's much more to it than that, but yeah.
Yeah, so you
Even outside the process for Linda, acting under ethically, she'd have problems sitting in the room.
She'd have to tell me.
Yeah.
And if she wasn't allowed to tell me, there'd be red flags going off everywhere. But there was no $500,000 new doctor boyfriend. And there was just a woman who was trying
only
to do
500.
Yeah, just
Yeah, he was a shit doctor as a GP. But yeah, no, okay, it's interesting. But I just wanted to say as well, like that was brilliant. We should do that more often, shouldn't we?
Mm-hmm.
Are you here? Yeah, like that. We don't do that enough, and we have matters that warrant it, and whether it's a lack of people in Sydney who'll do the modelling or not finding.
I think that's right, and it doesn't have to be collaborative. Like Clarissa was saying, in all of her matters, she tries to get the financial on because it can just change the options.
Yeah, I would say 90% of the work that we do is adversarial work.
Can I indicate?
I like the point that John
Sorry,
made.
Antonella.
Sorry.
You go, Avril, and then we'll come to you, Antonella.
Thank you.
I just like the point. It just really embedded that idea that Linda being known as part of that, having your team, arranging your team as a backup, if it even gets close to being adversarial, and you've got someone who's collaboratively trained, coming in, even if they're not the participation neutral, you still get to the end of the process because you've picked people that you can rely on and trust. I think that really flags that. Other than it being visually very important and holding account and all the rest, it's just that you've got those people there that you can turn to.
Antonella?
Thank you. The point I was going to raise is that the beauty of all of this is that once you get through the collaborative training and you join a practice group, you start making the connections with the fabulous financial neutrals that can assist you not only in your collaborative matters, but in what we're tending to now do is collaborative mediations as well. And for example, in our practice group in Southern Sydney, where of which Shelby's our fearless leader, we definitely run a lot of discussions in our group about what we're doing, how we're doing it, what the benefits are. So all this discussion that we're having today is starting to become a more normal pattern of how we prepare and present our matters, not only in that collaborative space. So this sort of information that Linda's been presenting today starts to become much more common in your conversations. So yeah, and it's wonderful. I don't know how we did it without this sort of information beforehand. So yeah, it's great.
It can be very helpful in, your non-collaborative matters because you've actually got a genuine data to work off as to why you've got evidence. This proposal isn't going to work because we've gone and got some advice and this is what it actually looks like for our lady.
Can you imagine that evidence in a decent spousal maintenance claim?
I ran a mediation yesterday. Antonella was involved. We didn't have a financial, but I took Linda's thought process on board and really quickly did some calculations, and numbers is not my strong point. But that was the only way I think that matter got across the line yesterday, Antonella. You can probably speak for your client, but the husband was so entrenched. He was a lawyer, high income, wife had nothing. And it wasn't until he saw the deficit that he was able to appreciate what she needed.
It's also great when you're preparing arguments in relation to an adjustment for Section 75 two factors, because you're then not only positioned to look at a spousal maintenance argument, but looking at the long-term deficit on a needs basis as well. So this type of data has application across numerous fronts when you're building your case. But yeah, certainly that matter we had yesterday, that was the first meeting that we had, but I'm definitely going to talk to my lady about bringing some of this to the table because she needs it. And the power of the data is just, you can't beat that when you have a graph as, for want of a better word, as graphic as Linda had set out for the wife in that first example, where the red just keeps going up. What can you say once that's on the table? So, yeah, definitely love it.
Might move on to the next example. Is that screen shared?
Yeah.
Yep.
The next one, this actually, we can link slightly back to the clients in this matter. Jock and Nancy had developed a four-wheel driving assisting tool, for a better word, and it actually happened 13 years beforehand. The husband had been driving on the beach, went wrong, tide came in, he worked for 6 hours trying to get his car out, and he thought, I can do better than this, and he developed a product, and that product was awesome. He's still mad about the outdoors, extremely big picture bloke. In relation to his wife, Nancy, she was allied health trained, very detailed person. And the two of them actually complement each other so well. Early 50s, 2 adult children, living out of home. The business, they'd always done okay as a couple before this. He was in a trade, so she was in allied health. They developed this product and they'd poured everything into it. They didn't live a lavish lifestyle. They didn't take much out of the business. Everything was left in there. And the last couple of years, you'll see shortly, they'd actually developed a business that was growing extremely rapidly and was making a really good amount of profit, which again was majority was left in the business. The actual pool itself was a really different pool in that the majority of the value of not only the business, but also the pool of assets actually related to intangible assets, goodwill, and the IP associated with the product. And there's this, I'm linking this one with his favorite thing was that if it wasn't the beach, it was the outback. So again, the same process you had before: define the pool, consider the cash flow, options into developing pathways, determine a preliminary pathway, reality test that pathway, which really came to its fore here. We had a couple of goes. And then you do that tinker and test. That's not going to work because, but we could maybe do this. So getting to the issues of this matter, and there were lots, but although this was probably one of my most difficult matters to be associated with, it was actually one of the most delightful because the parties were, I absolutely rated the people we worked with. Very different people, personality-wise. The way they worked was extremely different, but they developed with me a lot of respect in their own ways. And there were a lot of issues that came up, and there was a fair bit of conflict within the room. So business experiencing high growth, the issues, the risks that were there was one product. So the whole business evolved around one product and 2 major clients. Majority of the business value was goodwill. Interestingly, and I'm sure this will come up, they didn't agree on my result. I value the business, and the husband said, I don't think it's worth that much. And so we put some things in place there. And in the process, right to the end, he was still at the point, I don't think it was worth that much, but I accept the way we've actually dealt with that. So there are things you can do to move past that. Business value is majority of the pool. There were mammoth Division 7A issues. So we're talking around $7 million. Because this has started from scratch, the goodwill that was there and the IP had no cost base. So there was a mammoth underlying tax penalisation cost, which again, do you take it into account or not? These guys are mid-50s. That Rosati's principle, are you likely to realise in the foreseeable future? When the husband looked at the actual numbers, the first thing he said, all right, well, let's sell it. So again, that comes up in this process as well. Jock, the CEO, big picture, loved the outdoors, hated being indoors, and hated conflict. So from that point of view, with Nancy working actively in the business, they both worked there. She ran the office, he ran the product, sales, marketing, research, development. He kept disappearing. He was the emu sticking his head in the sand. So he would just disappear for periods on end, doing camera shoots where he'd go away for 2 weeks and can we have a meeting? No, Jock's gone. He'll be back probably in a couple of weeks. Right, okay, so you imagine there was a few delays that actually happened in this. So Jock big picture, Nancy detail, which from a business point of view worked extremely well. From this process point of view, was really difficult, because if we could connect with Nancy, Jock was out the door, he was lost. And if we connected with Jock, Nancy would get frustrated that the actual detail wasn't there. So they concentrated on different things. From the start, it was likely that Nancy would be leaving the business and Jock would either keep the business or sell the business. We did go through the process of could they actually hold the business together, and that was actively discussed, but it was likely that Nancy was going to leave the business. If that was the case, given that she ran the office, the whole bookkeeping, accounting side, dealt with all of the suppliers, did all the employees as well. If Nancy was leaving the business, there's obviously going to be a hole in actually running the business. Here's big picture. The place ran well as a team. She was running the office. With her gone, how's the business going to operate? As it turned out, although Jock made the big impression that he was the big player, he was fairly risk adverse. She was probably more acceptable to risk than he was. So this whole change of operation, potentially it was going to come up, was scaring, to be starting the French, it was scaring the shit out of him. And that was actually one of the things that we actually ultimately linked back to him disappearing. He was sticking his head in the sand because he was scared. And although he never said it, he actually recognised the contribution that she made and how important it was in the office. So there were a couple of hurdles we got over, and we had these breakthroughs. When we actually got them talking about it, there was a lot of non-financial issues that came to play. So the numbers. Can work out how to do this now.
John, just while you're doing that, I've transferred the hosting across to you. Because, guys, I have to race. I'm at home. I've got to race to the office for a 9:30 phone mention. So I'm going to magically disappear in the next 5 minutes. But John is in charge. And all you need to know for the week ahead is if you haven't done that group role play,
opportune time to phase out.
Super fun activity for your workbook this week. And that's all I need to tell you.
Okay, so can people see the Excel spreadsheet now? Yeah? Okay. So now I'm in my comfortable zone. I've got Excel spreadsheets in front of me. Remember, the first step there is to define the pool. That defining the pool, from my point of view, that defining the pool, in this case here, meant a lot of work. Now, I don't intend for a second to go through all of these things, but you can see here that there's a level of, there was multiple entities that had to be consolidated. We had to go through each of those, actually look at the actual trends that are actually happening. We can see the growth in the business that's sort of coming through. So 5 million, 6 million, 8 million. The forecast for this business was $8.5 million. Everything had to be consolidated from that. Then we've got the other entities. Once we actually worked out, was there goodwill associated or value of IP, which we did. We came up with the capitalized value of sort of $10 to $12 million, growing quickly. We then had to value all the other entities. So again, I don't want to go through all of those spreadsheets. The important thing is what we end up doing was bringing it back to simple numbers. So from a point of the valuing all the entities, which I'd gone through the value of the entities, we then just came through with line numbers. So the point of view that the actual primary entity was worth about $9 million. The corporate beneficiary was worth $5.5 million. And that's partly where these Division 7A issues were coming into play. We quantified with Division 7A ultimately. Now I'm jumping, this is a series of meetings with the party's accountant, with party's tax advisor. There's a whole lot of, this happened over a series of sort of 4 to 6 months where we finalised accounts and worked out ways to structure things. So a lot of parties come into play, but bring it back into the room. There was tax on dividends, Div 7As. We had the structure had been redone recently, but hadn't been finalised. So there was some underlying CGT and stamp duty consequences coming through. That's what I talked about before. There was no cost base in relation to the goodwill and IP. If you take into account, it was about $4.5 million. If you ignore it, it's not $4.5 million. You can see that's a major effect on the pool of assets. So from an entity viewpoint, the entity is valued up between 8.5 and 13. We had some super, a house which ultimately sold. They'd made a deposit on a unit, which I won't even bother today, but there was a whole range of other issues that came in relation to the unit. He'd actually put a deposit on a unit up the coast, which was, again, another hurdle we had to get past. And that was how we actually got past it, by she took the same amount out. But my point is that we have a pool of between 11 and $15 million. And that's just fast track, I said, probably 4 months worth of work with the parties being actively involved in how do we actually value this, and settling it down with where the pros and cons, the drivers behind how we did it, and getting sort of an acceptance in, there's our pool, it's in that range. So the husband at this stage was very much advocate for, I will sell it and we should take the tax into account. The wife's view was, you won't sell it, there's so much more you want to do, and by the time you sell it, this will be a completely different beast in 10 years' time. So the 15 is relevant. That second stage we looked at was looking at the cash flows. In this case here, unlike a lot of the matters we do, they're in a situation where their cash flow is improving dramatically year on year, and they hadn't been drawing a lot on it. What we were finding, though, with the amount they had historically agreed to take individually, he was starting to get jack of that and saying, the money's there, I want to spend some. And she was still being very conservative until, until the actual matters settled, we keep the actual status quo in what we were doing. But there wasn't a cash flow issue per se. Next thing was to actually start look at that option generation process. So in this case here, a little bit different, because we've got a reasonably complex pool. There were a lot of moving parts in relation to what could or couldn't happen. So one of the issues with this pool, and the reason it's been broken up this way, is ultimately that's how we actually dealt with it. The actual business had been accumulating cash. So at the start of the process, there was $2 million in the bank account. By the end of the process, there was over $3 million in the bank account. So what I've done there is actually dragged a few things out, and you can see partly the way we're developing the pathways with the next line being debt raising. But the idea is to set it up, this spreadsheet up, so we can use it as a template to work out our pathways that everyone can still get their head around. And too many numbers on a page, and the husband in this instance had a lot of trouble keeping up, where he just turned to his accountant, who, in this case, another important point, his accountant attended all the meetings. Not as an advisor to the group, not as a part of the team. He was there as, he actually did the accounts. It was a highly accounting exercise. He was there to help. He also gave the husband a lot of comfort being in the room. Wife was okay with that. I was still running the financial side, and I was very happy with him being there as well, because it's a good resource for me. So having him in the room, there was an extra wheel in there. So developing the pathways, what we did with these was to actually do completely offline meetings. So we agreed on the pool, and then we broke up into our teams. I would sit down with the husband and his solicitor, who was Clarissa, and then do the same with the wife. In this case here, we started with the wife, for no particular reason. And from a 2-hour meeting, we did the option generation process. We talked about what could be done. In a 2-hour meeting, we developed 5 possible pathways. They were just big picture pathways. How could we do this? The first 3 scenarios, completely outside of our control, but we would raise funds. So the business actually borrowed money from the bank and used that as part of the property settlement. The 4th scenario was that the wife stayed as part of the business in some way, shape or form, whether there's control there, whether that she's just a significant shareholder, whether she's paid out over time, whatever it might be. But in this case, from a big picture viewpoint, she stays as part of the process. And the last one is that she gets out, there's no funds raised, but he pays her off over time. And you can imagine sort of the issues that are coming up in relation to a large sum being paid to her over time. So we talked about the debt raising. The other side of it was that there were significant surplus cash holdings within the business. So we're using those to actually affect a settlement. But if you take cash out of a company, what do you create? Loans. What are loans in a company? Div 7A. So we had all these tax issues that started coming up in relation to how we settled this process. So we already had big tax issues. Now we potentially have more. So in this case here, Nancy's looking from, this is what would come out of the business or out of the actual property pool for her. So you can see there's $3 million in cash, $4 million in cash, $5 million in cash, and the other two are $2 million. She either would or wouldn't share in the Division 7A tax issues. And then there was a split of all of the other assets that they had. So the final balancing item was a deferred payment coming back. And that deferred payment, depending on whether she's part of the business or not, would depend on what she's actually putting in there as the bottom line. So you'll see the actual bottom line that she proposed ranged from 6.5 million up to 7. That range depended on the risk that she was facing and the risks that he was facing. So if he was vendor financing, she felt that she was taking all the risk. She lacked confidence in how he would take the business without her being involved, and thought that he could stuff it up. So she was basically saying, if I'm going to take the risk with you, I'm having more. If there was a bigger deferred payment, even though they're raising cash, again, she upped it a little bit to actually say to him, I'm taking more risk. Where she stayed part of the business, she was good with. There was she was retaining a $3.5 million interest in the business. So the deferred payment was really her shareholding. So in that 2-hour meeting, we came up with 5 pathways, and then I had a meeting with the husband. Now, I'm not going to go through those today, but we came up with 5 pathways. But the beauty of this process is that I've already been with the wife. Now, I'm at this stage, I'm not disclosing what the wife was saying, but I can use that information in my suggestions to him. So in relation to that, we did talk about, firstly, let's raise some debt. Yep, good with that. Okay, how much credit? Should we use examples of maybe $1, $2, and $3 million? Great idea. So we're already at our first 3 that we've actually done here. What else could happen? Maybe Nancy could stay as a partner. Oh, yeah, that's not going to happen. And it was quite a lively discussion. But when we actually talked about the pros and cons, he actually said, Lana went, I don't think it's going to work, but okay, let's just throw it down. I don't think it's going to work. And then the vendor finance, which was by far his preference. We ended up coming up with 5 pathways that, although the deferred payment at the bottom was different, they were broadly the same pathway. So from there, we could actually go back to the table and say, let's talk about it. And we actually started looking at this pathway, being that we'd raise money from the bank. And that's where our issues started. He then disappeared. Certain information had to be given to the bank. The bank wanted to know what was going on in relation to forecasting. He didn't know the numbers. His accountant wasn't close enough to the business. And suddenly 6 months had gone by and the wife was losing her cool. That's where we got the accountant to step up and do some more work, to step in the shoes of the husband, actually come up with forecast information. And we started moving forward, and that worked. I'll just now flip back to we ended up going through a series of meetings and structuring ideas. We had their tax advisor in, we had their accountant involved. I've now fast forward a 12-month period. In that 12-month period, I'll say we encountered various issues which we dealt with one by one. But ultimately in this process, a certain amount of cash came out. In relation to that cash, because we straddled that financial year, we actually end up making the advance undeducted contributions to super for both parties. So a lot of the cash that was actually sitting there ended up being put into superannuation, which is a self-managed fund, and ultimately rolled over to the wife. Instead of actually receiving cash, which she would have had limitations in how she could put it into super, we actually did it through the structure, preempted what was going to happen, and then we could actually give her more super on the way out.
That's actually quite an effective, I think the big difference with that super, coming from my financial planning hat, having the flexibility to use both members' contribution caps in collaborative matters, I've seen that used very effectively when people are open to finding, you know, good solutions for both people.
Mm. So if we just quickly dash through this, we're running a bit short on time. She got about $2.5 million in cash, but in different forms, including super. They raised some cash. $2.5 million was ultimately how much cash they got in there. And from a business point of view, one of his huge concerns was, I'm now actually running a business with a high level of debt and without my wife being there. So how do we do that? And from a cash flow, we ended up not doing their personal cash flows. We did a high level of cash flows for the actual business itself, and actually did sensitivities now around the actual cash flows. If sales dropped by 5% or 10%, what would that mean? If sales increased by 10%, what would that mean? We also ended up, and this was because we've got a recruitment section here, we ended up finding a financial controller for the husband's business. And as part of that, stepped into that role, far more accounting and business experience than the wife had, and the relationship worked really well. The only issue that came up from it is he started looking at the financials that we'd used for our valuation and realised that there was actually errors in them that actually stuffed up the stock calculations, and it changed the profit by 800 grand in that year. So mammoth issues. So we had to go back to the drawing board, revalue the whole lot, and actually resettle this. So this is the resettled amount. From the husband's point of view, he wanted cash because he had bought that unit up the coast, and he didn't actually want a mammoth debt. He was getting very risk adverse. He got his head around the debt in the business, having debt outside as well. He was worried that if the business fell over, he would lose everything. So with that, he was actually wanting to actually get the house separated to the business as much as possible and have as minimum amount of debt, but also he wanted to quarantine superannuation. So he was really quite clear that I must have superannuation on the way out, even though it would have made the actual settlement far easier if we get more super to her. For him, he knew that would actually save, basically, if the business went down, he'd keep his super. So he saw that as his little, he really did, as his little nest egg. Nothing about tax, nothing about structuring. It was about, I can't lose that. And we actually structured in a way that was no deferred payment. So how we dealt with the issue of having that sort of, do we take tax in or out? The wife very quickly said, let's just carve it down the middle. And the husband went, okay. So we had a ballpark with where we're actually standing. Ultimately, she accepted to take less of an amount if she could get it all up front. And that's that way it worked. I'll just quickly get to... Hopefully you can see this last one now. Some of the other issues that we encountered, the time delays of the husband's approach. We used the accountant to actually step into his shoes. The business losing the wife, we got a financial controller input. We need to find funds to affect the settlement. We raised funds with the bank, separate bank to what they'd used previously. We came to the issue with the financial statements were incorrect. We had to revise the pool and then determine a new pathway as a result. And then ultimately the pathway we actually worked on, when we actually did the reality testing on what the actual business would do, seeing if we had an increase or decrease in sales, we ended up amending the pathway again, purely to actually take a little bit of the pressure of the business and therefore the husband being able to move forward. So from that point of view, it was a really interesting matter to be involved with. And it actually went over about a year to a year and a half from start to finish. But it was a really satisfying one from the point of view that we just kept getting hurdle after hurdle, trying to keep the parties controlled and in the process. They were both really good people. But they were pushed to the end of their tether with the actual where the process was going and just the fear that and frustration that was coming in.
I think when I look at that matter, you kind of go, well, how would all of those issues been dealt with in any other process? You even think trying to come up with those types of solutions in a one-day mediation or litigation model, completely different picture, I think.
What really came out of it, it wasn't accounting skills, lawyering skills. Everyone was drawing on business skills and life skills to come up. And it really was, this worked because it was a team. This also worked because the parties were who the parties were. But in a less collaborative approach, this would have been an absolute disaster. And we almost went down the path of, we actually did scenarios around it. We got to the point where the husband threw his hands up and said, I'm not doing it. I'm not taking this level of debt on. Let's look at selling it. So we went down the pathway of what that would look like. Now, you didn't see that there today, but that was all mapped out. And what was really interesting was, and it shocked the husband, all those tax consequences come into play, but where the husband hadn't actually realised, because he'd never been through that process, is the business was nowhere near sale ready. So to actually try to sell it at that point of time would have actually cost on the valuation. They wouldn't have got I think a 5 times multiple. They probably would have got 4 or less than a 4 because of the actual lack of diversification and set up the systems just wasn't there yet. And that's what the financial controller was going to put into place. So where the valuation dropped to something like $8 million, then take the tax off, suddenly the two of them walking away with about $3 million, which was still, she was sitting there going, okay, that'll do me. I don't live that lifestyle. He sat there going, no, the journey's not over yet. I'm not prepared to do that and sacrifice that value. Let's go back to the old one and work on that. So it was a really dynamic situation that we actually all dealt with, and each week was, producing a different problem, a different thing to actually try to resolve. But it really highlighted also the team working together, but doing all of the debriefs, doing the planning, and doing touch points where we actually wouldn't have a joint meeting for a couple of months. There were things being worked on, making sure everyone was up to date with where it was, particularly the clients, and being able to touch base with them, saying, are you okay? Everything. It'd be a 5-minute phone call, but it made all the difference with these guys.
So we're kind of at time. We have one more little example to go through, but there's no Excel spreadsheets. It'll probably take 10 minutes. And that's one where it's the combination of using an accountant and a financial planner. So would you like us to push on?
It is 1:15. If you need to drop out.
That's fine. Bye, Shelby.
It's recorded. So I was just talking to Clarissa, and just if you've got to go, click back on the recording, will be circulated and you'll be able to watch the end of it.
Cool.
Have a good day.
Okay, bye.
Linda.
See you later. So this matter, both John and I were a part of. So I was brought in later than John. John was on board straight away. He did the I think there were about 3 entities involved in this. It was a specialist medical practitioner, but he'd actually gone into business, setting up quite a unique business anyway in his particular area of specialty. So there was a little bit of, I think, IP and a new business model that could have potentially been great, but at the time it was very early days. So really at the start of a business with really no earnings at all. So the issue here was that, you know, we often see this situation where, you know, being married young, wife supported the husband through all of the learnings of becoming a specialist medical practitioner. So then they finally get to the point where they're earning the big dollars, and then the marriage kind of collapses and there's really no assets, but he has a significant income. So we were dealing with that situation. So how that kind of worked was that we actually had a joint meeting, just the professionals, and we came together and just said, look, this is really problematic. We've got debt. We've actually got almost a negative asset position, but we've got this high income. How are we actually going to work together, and how is all the debt structured? So the proposal was to sell a family home, but we then realised that the debt was actually being used as security against the home, and there was really no value in the business itself. So how are we going to deal with that? So it was, again, a bit of that stage process, doing that loop of going back and doing more homework. Okay, well, if the house must be sold, how do we go about, who's going to talk to the banker? How, you know, who, you know, I think his mum was their accountant, their bookkeeper, and she was actually in control. She had a lot of knowledge. So we regroup and say, okay, well, who's going to go and ask the mum these questions? Come back to the group, let us know what you've learnt, workshop some ideas. And then I think John stepped out of the
largely,
yeah, because we felt like John had done everything he could to, you know, bring all the information that, you know, we needed to the table.
It really was like a tag team. I did the valuation of the group, came up with my bad news, tag team Linda to go and solve the problem.
Yeah, thanks, Handball. Can you move it on to the next slide, John, please? So you can see there, these are the things that John did. Then we met, we exchanged ideas, talked about all the debt, negative equity, all those types of things. We then went away and developed cash flow impacts. We worked with the wife on, so we had separate meetings. So our firm had a meeting with the husband, meeting with the wife, talked about what was going on. There were a lot of emotional things going on. He'd managed to, I think they split up, I think a year ago. Within 5 months, he was living with one of the nurses that was in his practice. Just prior to us having the meeting to discuss how we were going to manage the future cash flow, he announced that he was engaged and his new partner was pregnant. So all of this quite devastating. The wife was dead set on the children attending one of Brisbane's most expensive schools. He was obviously very stressed about that. For him, it wasn't important. He was like, well, I went to Cairns State High and I turned out fine. I don't see why the boys need to go to this school. One of the boys had actually a bit of special needs issues, so there was a bit of conjecture around whether this particular school was the right fit for the son. So there was considerable discussion around the school because the school issue sucked so much of the future cash flow out of the picture. So we actually then had a second meeting with the wife to really drill down on the school issue and to find out what it was that was really driving behind all of that. And we then workshopped with her what any possible, because she was just like, no, that's it. They're going to that school. He promised they were going to go to that school. That's it. He can pay. That's the end of it. But when we could show her graph and the impacts to her future cash flow, in terms of, we were saying, well, okay, if our goals are to meet an $80,000 a year income need, and he's only got you know, say 250 after tax income, next year we've got $50,000 worth of school fees coming into play, and yet we're trying to meet your cash flow needs. So the options are either the money goes to the school, or maybe some of that money might come into your household to actually support you and the kids in the house. And so we had those options. So it was kind of like a mini option generation meeting with her, saying, this is what it looks like. Are you still comfortable prioritizing as your number one goal the children at that school? Because it's impacting on your ability to meet your other goal, which is $80,000 a year. So we spent a lot of time doing that. We talked about the needs of the kids, and then she admitted that they actually did have a second option. And the second option was half the cost of the very expensive school. And we talked through why they hadn't pursued that option, what would happen if she had that cash flow, not the school, in her income, all of those things. And after that meeting, we then left with some homework. So her homework was to call that second school, find out whether the child who was due to go next year to that school, whether he could possibly get an interview, and whether he was on the list still, whether he could possibly get entry. So all of those things she was kind of sent to do some homework on, and you could see her opening up that option. Before it was just, no way, I'm not even looking at it. But when she could see the impact of them going to that school in year 6 and year 10 and all the way through, there was a bit of a penny drop moment where she went, oh, yeah, maybe I should actually look at something else. Maybe I shouldn't be quite so fixed and positional. So that's kind of what we were left with. We then went ahead with our meeting. It wasn't as collaborative as you would have hoped, given the announcements that had gone on in the weeks prior. There'd been some communication between them that was really unhelpful. Wife had sent a couple of pretty nasty kind of texts. So in the end, that collaborative meeting was actually conducted at our office in 2 rooms. And we had a staff member in one room, I was in the other room, and we had all the spreadsheets and all that graphing that you've seen with the other matter up on the screen. And each of us were altering that in real time with each of those clients. And then we would then regroup with the lawyers in another room. So we'd leave the client, we had food, all of that, in snacks for them. We would then regroup. So that was probably a 5-hour meeting on a Friday afternoon. And I think at about 8 o'clock that night, we got pretty close, and then we decided to call it a day. And then they reached an agreement, I think about a month later. And that was all about future cash flow. It was all about spousal support, child support, changing the school, releasing some of that cash flow. And that was pretty much it.
Good work. Great. Any questions?
No?
Time for the second coffee and Friday's work.
When you say it all quickly like that, it seems easy.
Yeah. Yeah, there's only like a few months in between.
Yeah.
Can I just finish by saying, though, that option generation process, it really does work in every situation, provided the team works together and you can bring them back to, this is your process, what do you want to do? And if they're sitting there going, I'm not budging, at the end of the day, that's what they're choosing to do.
That's it. Yeah.
All you can do is try to facilitate a way forward for them.
So yeah, we don't know what's happening next week. Do you know what's happening next week, John?
Next week's a wrap up.
That's right.
That's
the end.
A quick overview and then to talk about everything. Chat fest.
Cool. I may have a video on another matter that we worked on, and if that manages to get produced, I'll pop that on the Facebook page and group, and people can have a little look at that. It won't be long. It'll only be like 10 minutes.
Michael and I have worked in a situation where we've done a financial settlement in exactly that way of shuttle and swapping numbers between the rooms. Are there any tools that, if we're in as the mediator or the FDR or the facilitator or the communications person, and they're resisting bringing such skills as yourselves in, are there tools that we can turn to that you would recommend?
It depends, I think, which tools you're talking about.
Mm.
You know, as family lawyers, you guys put together the pools all the time. We're sort of, you know, stepping on your toes a little bit there. But we try to do it in a way that's very user-friendly for this process. In relation to the expense analysis, yes, there are spreadsheets that they can simply fill in. I've got one as well. It's not mind-blowing, but they fill in their weekly amounts, their monthly amounts, and it calculates the annual cost for them a year. So those sort of tools are there. A lot of the other tools, though, it comes from just what we know. You know, those working out how we set those spreadsheets up, they may exist, I don't know them.
Yeah. The problem with doing future projections is that you're stepping into that realm of personal financial advice. And it's all about the assumptions. So if you don't have if you're not confident about the assumptions that you're using and the blowback from that, because we know the assumptions that we use are very generally used. We've used them in all of our other personal financial advice stuff. So we know we can refer back to that and say, well, look, you know, we assume there was going to be 2.5% inflation, for instance, and, you know, we've got long-term data that backs that up. So that's the risk that you take. You can do really simple things on Excel spreadsheets, like saying, well, you know, if you had $500,000 to invest, and you could put it back on the parties, what kind of returns would you expect to get from a $500,000 or $1 million investment, say in your super? What have you earned in the past? And you could, you know, make notes to say that they supplied the return expectations, and then it's just a simple spreadsheet kind of calculation where you're just kind of pushing that forward. But generally, though, that stuff that I showed you with that first matter, that's quite a lot of work for our team to pull together, because there's so many moving parts to that, and it has to be done for each particular circumstance. There's not one that actually works for everyone, because you'll get things like new start allowance popping into some of these things. You'll get tax that the brackets change a lot. So it does kind of have to be developed pretty much individually.
So when you're arranging the team and those sorts of things come up, it is really responsible, up to the team to try and get the clients to understand the benefit of bringing you on board, isn't it? I mean, that's where we have to kind of each turn to the client in our different roles collaboratively to bring that I'm not doing this attitude to a more where you might need the benefit of some of this information. And
where we see a lot of that coming in is probably coming in for a task as opposed to the whole process, or just having discussions. Often we'll get calls from two lawyers who are collaborating a matter, and they get in resistance. They'll come and say, what do you think we should do? And we talk about, we may still not get involved. We may be able to sort of say, look, maybe try this. And it's a 20-minute phone call, and It's just a freebie from our point of view, but it's part of that community.
Yeah, I'd definitely say that. The other thing that I think is worthwhile is when you're thinking about, well, we're identifying that there's an issue that could be solved with some useful interaction from we need more data here to be able to help you to make a decision. I think that kind of psychological loss aversion thing that people have can help with that. It's like, well, you know, we don't know here what potentially we're missing. You know, there's a lot of data here that is missing out of this thing. By spending a little bit of money getting this data, you actually might save yourself, you know, losses in the future because you haven't. So I think a little bit of just that sensible loss aversion type discussion about, you know, potentially where they might. And as well, a lot of people don't actually access this type of advice themselves anyway, you know, like pre-retirement planning, all of that kind of stuff. So a lot of people don't really know where they're heading, even as a couple. So I dealt with a matter in Sydney the other day where the fellow, you know, his age, I think 60, and the wife was 64 or something. And he said, oh, look, actually, I don't even know. I don't even know whether I can afford to retire anyway. And I probably should have done this work earlier. So by actually accessing the information now, you're kind of wrapping that up. You're wrapping up their pre-retirement planning anyway. They're actually accessing planning that they probably would have done anyway, but they're accessing it during their matter to make sure that they're not going to make a material mistake that's going to impact them moving forward. So it was kind of like wrapped it up, and you would have paid a couple of $1,000s to get that type of information, pre-retirement type planning anyway. So wrap it up into this, and at least you know where you're heading.
Yeah. I think a big one there is just pick up the phone and ask.
Yeah.
Have the chat.
Yeah.
And from that point of view, I mean, I'm a mammoth advocate on pretty much every collaborative role that I'm in, having a lender sitting outside helping one of the parties. The difference in the actual process is quantifiable.
Yeah.
Gee, thank you, John.